The torches hissed against the damp stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh, burning honey, and something darker, iron, maybe blood, somewhere deep under the marble floors of the Palace of Alexandria, in a hidden chamber no map dared to show. The night began to tremble. A girl, and no older than 15, stood at the center of the room. Her skin glowed with oil, smooth as glass, glistening under golden light. She wore only a thin linen wrap, nothing more than a whisper against her trembling body. Her eyes flickered toward the open door, where shadows moved like waiting spirits. Outside, drums echoed faintly from the city above. The festival of Isis had begun. But here, beneath the earth, it was silent. No cheers, no laughter, only the low hum of men and women chanting in a language older than Egypt itself. A tall figure stepped forward, wrapped in robes of ivory and gold. Her perfume reached the girl before her voice did, a sweet, deadly mix of lotus and smoke. She was Cleopatra VII, last queen of Egypt, daughter of the gods, ruler of life and death. Her voice was soft, almost kind, but it carried a weight that made the candles tremble. "Do not fear," she said, brushing the girl's chin with her gold-tipped fingers. "Tonight, you are not a child. You are the goddess Isis herself. What happens here is not sin. It is the most sacred act that keeps Egypt alive." The priests bowed their heads. The room filled with the sound of rattles and drums, the smell of wine and incense wrapping around them like smoke from another world. The girl tried to speak, but her lips only trembled. Her heart raced against her ribs. She could hear the beating, thump, 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 like the pulse of a trapped bird. Her hands shook as one of the women poured oil over her hair, whispering blessings that sounded more like curses. Above her, painted across the domed ceiling, were the eyes of Horus, wide, watching, unblinking. Cleopatra smiled faintly. She lifted a golden cup filled with a dark red liquid. It wasn't wine. Its scent was sharp, metallic, and wrong. She turned to the men in linen masks, each holding silver instruments that gleamed like knives. "Bring him," she said. From the shadows, they dragged a man forward, strong, bare-chested, and terrified. He was bound by ropes, his eyes darting in panic. When he saw Cleopatra, he tried to kneel, but his knees gave way before he could reach the floor. The guards forced him to stand before her. "Do you know who you serve?" she asked quietly. "You serve the body of Isis, the voice of Hathor, the breath of Egypt." The man didn't answer. He couldn't. His lips moved, but no sound came out. A small glass vial was placed at his mouth moments before. The liquid within shimmered green and gold under the torchlight. The queen tilted her head. "Good," she murmured. "He is awake. He can feel, but he cannot speak." The priests murmured in awe. Even the bravest among them avoided meeting her eyes. This was Cleopatra's secret chamber, her laboratory of the soul, where medicine and sin mixed freely, and where the line between worship and cruelty disappeared. The girl gasped when Cleopatra took her hand. The queen's skin was cool, almost cold. Her bracelets jingled like tiny bells. Cleopatra guided her toward the altar, a slab of polished stone that shimmered faintly with moisture. On it lay the instruments, golden cups, thin blades, oils thick with strange herbs. Symbols of the gods were carved into the stone: Ankh, eye, serpent, sun, each representing power over life and death. "Look," Cleopatra whispered in the girl's ear. "You see this man? Tonight he will speak to the gods through you. His body will feed the river of power that flows through Egypt. Do not cry, you are not flesh tonight. You are divinity." The girl's breath caught in her throat. Her tears mixed with oil, shining under the torchlight like stars on water. The drums grew louder. The chanting became faster, urgent, desperate. Every sound vibrated through the walls like the heartbeat of something ancient. The queen raised her hand, and silence fell again. She turned to her priests, record every reaction, every sound, every breath, she commanded. "The gods demand precision." The bound man's eyes rolled wildly, filled with terror. He tried to scream, but his voice was locked inside his chest. He could only watch as the queen dipped her fingers into the red liquid and painted strange symbols on the girl's skin. "You are Isis reborn," she whispered. Your body is the key between worlds. The girl closed her eyes. The air around her shimmered. A strange warmth rose in her chest, part fear, part trance, part something unknown. The queen stepped back and lifted a curved blade. The torchlight slid across its edge like fire on water. The priests bowed low, touching their foreheads to the floor. Cleopatra looked down at them and said softly, almost to herself, "The gods do not forgive weakness. They demand beauty and blood." The blade trembled in her hand, but not from fear, from hunger, the same hunger that had built empires and destroyed them. Outside, the city of Alexandria danced and sang. Inside, under the marble floors, in this chamber of myrrh and copper, something unholy began. The girl gasped again, her voice breaking into a sob that echoed through the chamber. The priests began to chant faster. Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet. Cleopatra's face glowed with sweat, with power, with something too dark to name. The man's eyes widened in silent agony. The room filled with a mingled scent of myrrh, smoke, and blood. The golden chalices rattled on the altar, trembling as if they too feared the queen's will, and then silence. Only the hiss of burning oil, only the breathing of those who had seen too much. Cleopatra lowered her blade slowly. She looked at what she had done, not with regret, but with satisfaction. Then she smiled faintly and turned to the priests. "Seal this chamber," she said. "No one will speak of what the goddess demanded tonight." The men obeyed, their faces pale, their hands shaking. Cleopatra walked toward the exit, her robe trailing behind her, marked with dark stains. As she stepped into the torchlight of the corridor, her expression softened, not from mercy, but from pride. She whispered to herself, "Egypt lives because I do what others fear." And with that, she vanished into the shadows of her palace, leaving behind the scent of myrrh, oil, and something that would haunt those walls forever. But before I tell you exactly what happened in that sealed chamber, I need to show you the system that made it all possible. Before we can judge what Cleopatra did in that chamber, we must step back into the mind of ancient Egypt, where gods ruled everything: the harvest, the river, the womb, and even desire itself. To understand Cleopatra's madness, we must understand the system that praised her for it. Egypt's people believed that their rulers were not fully human. A pharaoh was a god in flesh, half mortal, half divine. Every heartbeat of the Nile, every sunrise over the desert, was said to depend on the purity of the ruler's connection to the gods. If the ruler fell out of balance, if the gods turned their faces away, Egypt could die. No rain, no crops, no life. So when Cleopatra looked into a mirror, she didn't see a woman. She saw Isis, the goddess of motherhood, of life, of magic. She was raised to believe that she was the link between heaven and earth, and that her body, her touch, her very breath could heal or destroy. This belief was the foundation of her system. It justified everything. It turned her palace into a temple, and her bed into an altar. Let me tell you about the Order of the Living Gods, the secret circle of priests who served Cleopatra's will. They whispered in her ear that she was chosen from birth. They reminded her that her veins carried divine blood, not the blood of humans, but of Ra, the sun itself. Every ritual, every kiss, every cruel experiment in that hidden chamber was built upon their words. You do not sin, O daughter of Isis. You restore balance. What others call sin, we call worship. They told her that the human body was a map, every nerve a river of energy that could be bent, awakened, or broken in the name of the gods. That pain was a door to enlightenment. That pleasure was a ladder to power. That death itself was only the next breath of rebirth, and she believed them. But belief was not free. It had a cost. The priest demanded offerings: animals, jewels, gold, and sometimes people. Those chosen for her chamber were not random. They were hand-picked from the temples: dancers, slaves, servants, even noblemen who had lost favor at court. Each was told they were serving Egypt by pleasing the queen, by letting their body become a vessel for the gods' experiments. If they died, their spirit was said to rise purified, glowing in the afterlife. If they lived, they were marked as holy, touched by the goddess herself. It was a cycle of fear disguised as faith. Cleopatra's court was not like any other. It was a theater of divinity. Every gesture she made had to be perfect. Her walk slowly on low and measured, as if the earth itself bowed with each step. Her eyes, painted black to imitate the falcon of Horus. Her jewelry, symbols of eternity, carved from lapis and obsidian. When she entered the temple, even her priests fell to their knees. They did not speak until she lifted her hand, and when she did speak, her voice carried the weight of divine law. "The gods speak through me," she would say. "When I touch the living, I test the spirit of Egypt itself." Imagine believing that every cruel act, every dangerous ritual, every twisted pleasure you performed was actually holy. Imagine the freedom and the corruption that would come with such belief. That was Cleopatra's world, and behind it all, there was science, or something that pretended to be science. The queen surrounded herself with healers, alchemists, and philosophers from Greece and Persia. They brought with them scrolls on anatomy, poisons, and nerves. Cleopatra saw their knowledge as tools of divinity. She didn't want to understand life. She wanted to control it. One of her physicians, an old man named Apollonius, once wrote secretly, "The queen demands to see what lies between life and death, to awaken the body without the soul, to silence pain, but leave the mind awake." That was the heart of her experiments, to break the boundary of human experience, to make the body obey the will of a god, and the priests cheered her on. Because if Cleopatra succeeded, it meant proof that she was more than mortal. It meant Egypt's queen truly was divine. It was the perfect trap, a system where no one dared to question her, where every cruel act was wrapped in gold and perfume, every scream drowned by drums and chants. If a man died on her altar, the priests said, the gods demanded his life. If he lived, they said, Cleopatra's mercy had saved him. In this world, truth didn't exist. Only divine justification. Let me show you something darker. In a hidden papyrus found centuries later, a priest named Horemakhet confessed before he died. He wrote, "We saw her eyes change. She believed herself no longer woman, but goddess. She tested potions on men who could not move, cut their skin, watched their tears, and called it sacred. She said that through their pain she could touch eternity. This was not healing. It was control. It was power disguised as holiness, and the people, they worshipped her for it. Because in their minds, Cleopatra was Egypt. If she sinned, then Egypt sinned. If she bled, then Egypt bled. And if she lived forever, then so would Egypt's glory. So when you hear the word ritual, think carefully. When you hear that Cleopatra dressed as Isis, remember it wasn't just costume. It was conviction. It was the armor of faith wrapped around a hunger for absolute power. This was the system that made her cruelty sacred. A world where morality bent under the weight of divinity, where no one could say no to a god in human form, and still whispers spread. Not everyone believed. Some called her mad. Some said she played with forces no mortal should touch. But to her priests and lovers, she was perfection. Her palace smelled of incense and iron. Her hands smelled of oils and blood. And every night another experiment began, another dance between mercy and madness. Subscribe now. This will change how you see history. Comment what you know. Watch till the end for real names and proof, because in the next part, you'll see the price of this divine illusion, the training, the initiation, and the human cost of becoming one of Cleopatra's sacred servants. Before the girl stood trembling before Cleopatra that night, she had already lived a life built for that single moment. She was not chosen by chance. She was made for it. In ancient Egypt, to serve the queen's private temple was considered an honor, but only from the outside. To the people, those chosen were called children of the goddess. To the priests, they were vessels. But to themselves, they were prisoners of gold. It always began the same way. A priest or royal messenger would visit villages along the Nile. They would look for children with bright eyes, soft voices, and skin untouched by scars or labor. Sometimes they told families that the gods had chosen their child. Sometimes they paid in silver. and sometimes they simply took them. At first, the children were told they were blessed. They were taken to temples surrounded by gardens and fountains, where music floated through the air and incense curled like mist. But soon they learned that the beauty hid something else. They were taught silence, obedience, perfection. Their smiles were trained, their gestures rehearsed. Every glance, every movement was corrected by tutors and priests. A raised eyebrow could mean punishment. A trembling hand could mean exile. Their days began before dawn. The temple bell would ring, and they would kneel on cool stone floors. Priests would pour cold water over their heads to purify them. Then came the lessons how to walk like a goddess, slowly, each step measured with grace. How to breathe during chants, never gasping, never loud. How to dance to the rhythm of the sistrum, that rattling sacred instrument of Isis. How to mix oils, myrrh, cinnamon, lotus, frankincense, each drop measured with precision. How to use herbs that could numb pain or awaken desire. Their minds were filled with rules that made no sense. Pain is a gift. Silence is holiness. Your body is not yours. It belongs to the goddess. At first the children cried at night, but the walls were thick and no one came. The priests said tears were impurities, leaving the soul. When they reached 13 or 14, the training changed. They were given strange potions that burned their throats and blurred their minds. Their dreams filled with fire and music. Their bodies were rubbed with thick oils that made the skin tingle and the senses sharpen. These were called the elixirs of awakening. They were said to open the inner eye, to make them feel the breath of the gods moving through them. But in truth, it made them weak, dependent, obedient. The girls were told they were brides of Isis. The boys were told they were sons of Horus, guardians of the queen's divine chamber. Both were told that their lives meant nothing outside the temple. They were no longer people, they were instruments of the ritual. Then came the initiation. The temple doors were closed. The air smelled of jasmine and wine. Candles lined the floor in the shape of the sacred eye. The chosen stood in the center, trembling, covered in gold dust and oil. The high priest would raise a knife over their head, not to kill but to mark a small cut on the shoulder or chest. Their blood was mixed with wine and burned in a bowl, symbolizing the offering of self. Then Cleopatra would appear, always barefoot, her robe shining like the morning sun. She would walk among them, her voice soft as silk, saying, "You are no longer of the earth. You are mine. And through me, you serve eternity." She would touch each one on the forehead with a drop of oil and whisper their new name. The moment she did, their old life vanished. From that day on, they were keepers of the secret, bound by oaths that promised divine favor or eternal torment. They could not speak to outsiders. They could not leave the palace. They lived for the rituals. Some found strange comfort in it. The palace gave them food, silk, music, and purpose. They were adored, admired, even worshipped during festivals. Crowds threw flowers when they danced for the queen. Their beauty was legend, but behind the marble and gold were punishments too cruel to name. If a servant disobeyed, they were taken away and never seen again. The others were told they had returned to the gods, but in truth, they had been used for experiments, the same kind Cleopatra performed on the bound man in the chamber. Some were given potions that slowed their breathing until they floated between life and death. Some were made to endure tests of divinity, where pain was measured, recorded, admired, and if one survived, they were called chosen. If they didn't, silence. One boy named Nikum was only 16. He was known for his soft voice and calm eyes. He once told another servant, "If the gods are so kind, why do they need our fear?" The next morning, he was gone. The priests said he had been called to the goddess, but a few whispered that his body was seen carried down into Cleopatra's lower chamber, wrapped in linen. The message was clear. Do not question. Do not think. Only serve. Years passed, and the chosen learned to hide their thoughts. Some grew proud, believing themselves truly divine. Others died inside, their souls quiet, but their faces smiling. The queen believed she had created the perfect instruments, beings trained to worship, to obey, to endure. They became the foundation of her rituals, the living tools of her quest to touch the gods. But there was a cruel irony. While she sought immortality through their suffering, she was already building her own destruction. Every scar, every death, every whispered secret added a crack to the illusion. And one day, the truth would rise like the Nile in flood, unstoppable. But before that reckoning, there were years of beauty, excess, and terror. The children of the goddess became part of the queen's legend, dancing in gold by day, trembling in darkness by night. They were the price of her divinity, the human cost of a queen who believed she could play God. Now, I need to tell you about the nights when the elites themselves joined in, when priests, generals, and rulers became part of Cleopatra's sacred debauchery. Above the marble courtyards of Alexandria, the city glittered like a dream. Gold lamps burned through the night, perfumed smoke curled around statues of gods, and the sea murmured beyond the walls. Every month, at the height of the moon, the festival of Isis turned the city into paradise. But the true festival, the one whispered about by merchants and sailors, didn't happen in the streets. It happened inside Cleopatra's palace, behind walls guarded by Nubian soldiers and sealed doors of cedar and bronze. The guests arrived in silence. They came in veiled litters, faces hidden, voices hushed. They were not ordinary people. They were priests, generals, scholars, and foreign envoys, the ones who controlled Egypt's wealth and armies. Each carried an offering, jars of wine, carved idols, or baskets filled with white lotus flowers. When they entered the queen's hall, the air itself seemed to change. Soft music floated through the shadows, flutes, drums, harps. The floor glowed with reflections from 1,000 oil lamps. Every column was painted with the eyes of gods. And at the center of it all sat Cleopatra. She was dressed not as a queen, but as Isis, reborn. Her gown shimmered like moonlight over water. Golden snakes coiled around her wrists and ankles. Her eyes were blackened with coal, her lips tinted red with crushed berries and wine. She didn't speak at first. She only raised her hand, and the entire room dropped to their knees. It wasn't love, it was fear wrapped in devotion. A high priest began the chant, "She is the breath of life, the mother of all, the giver of desire." Cleopatra rose slowly. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried across the hall like a spell. "Tonight," she said, "we join the gods in their eternal dance. No shame, no sin, only worship through ecstasy." The crowd repeated her words, their voices trembling. They knew the ritual. They had seen it before. And yet, each time, it felt as though they were standing on the edge of something forbidden. The servants entered, carrying trays of wine, honeyed figs, and small cups filled with shimmering blue liquid. It was mandrake and lotus, a blend that dulled fear and awakened desire. The elite drank, their eyes glassy with expectation. Music swelled. The children of the goddess entered, Cleopatra's chosen dancers, wrapped in silk, their bodies oiled and glowing. They moved in slow circles around the guests, their steps matching the rhythm of the drums. Each movement told a story of creation, temptation, death, and rebirth. And then the ritual began. The guests were invited to join the dance. The queen herself descended from her throne, her hands trailing gold dust that sparkled in the lamplight. She moved like smoke, every gesture deliberate, every look calculated to hypnotize. Beside her was Mark Antony, the Roman general who had fallen under her spell. To him, she was not merely a ruler, she was the universe. He followed her into these ceremonies, half in love, half enslaved. That night, Antony wore a crown of ivy and gold. He called himself Dionysus, the god of wine and madness, while Cleopatra declared herself Isis, the goddess of life. Together they led the guests into a performance that blurred the line between worship and indulgence. Wine spilled across marble floors. Laughter mixed with chanting. Perfume hung thick in the air. The elites called it divine unity. But in truth, it was hunger for power, for pleasure, for escape. Behind the music and laughter, the priests watched and recorded everything. They noted who pleased the queen, who hesitated, who resisted. Because in Cleopatra's court, participation was not optional. Refusal meant suspicion. Suspicion meant death. Every act of devotion became a test of loyalty. Every touch, every whisper was both pleasure and political performance. One story, told later by a trembling servant, described a senator from Rome who refused to kneel. He said, "I serve no goddess, only Rome." Cleopatra smiled. She offered him a cup of mandrake wine and said, "Then serve your pride to the gods." He drank it, and moments later, his legs gave way beneath him. The priests carried him out. He was never seen again. The message was clear. In that chamber, only one law existed, Cleopatra's will. To outsiders, these rituals were called feasts of the gods. But inside the palace, they had another name whispered in fear: the Nights of Testing. They were meant to show who was worthy to stand beside the queen in her divine madness. The strongest were rewarded with gold and favor. The weakest disappeared into the lower chambers where the real experiments took place. Sometimes the screams were faint, sometimes they echoed for hours. No one dared to ask what happened below. Cleopatra's reasoning was simple and terrifying. She told her priests, "The gods choose through pleasure and pain. Those who cannot endure do not deserve eternity." To her, every ritual was a purification, a way to separate the divine from the mortal. To everyone else, it was corruption, dressed as holiness. Yet the elites returned again and again. They came for power, for favor, for the illusion of touching eternity. And Cleopatra watched them all, smiling behind her golden veil. Each night she saw who trembled, who craved, who submitted. She learned their secrets, not just of the body, but of ambition. It was how she ruled them, not with swords, but with desire. As the years passed, these ceremonies became legend. Songs spoke of the queen who danced with gods. Poets wrote of her beauty and mystery. But the truth was darker. Behind the poetry was blood. Behind the gold was fear. Even her closest allies began to wonder, was she blessed or cursed? Was she goddess or monster? One night, during the final feast of Isis, Cleopatra stood on her balcony, overlooking the sea. The air smelled of wine and roses. Below her, the city glowed with firelight. She turned to her priests and said, "Let Rome see what divinity looks like." It was the beginning of her downfall, because outside those walls, rumors had begun to spread. Rumors of witchcraft, poison, and madness. To the Romans, she was no goddess. She was danger, a queen who could make men forget their loyalty, their honor, even their sanity. But inside her palace, the music played on. The dancers moved. The guests whispered prayers through trembling lips. And Cleopatra's smile hid the truth. The empire she built on pleasure and fear was beginning to rot from within. Now, I need to show you what that power looked like behind the curtains. The luxury, the seduction, and the hidden control that turned Cleopatra's palace into the most dangerous place on earth. The year was 33 BC. Cleopatra's palace no longer felt like a royal home. It felt like a living organism. Every corridor breathed with the rhythm of its queen's will. Every servant, every musician, every guard moved in harmony with the pulse of her ambition. Outside, Alexandria sparkled, the lighthouse gleaming like a jewel over the sea, the city's marble streets filled with trade and laughter. But inside the palace, the air was thick with perfume and politics. The scent of lotus oil and cinnamon disguised the smell of fear, because here everything was recorded. Every smile, every word, every touch. Behind those walls, luxury was not indulgence, it was a weapon. Cleopatra's chambers were unlike anything Rome had ever imagined. Silk curtains swayed like waves. Gold cups overflowed with wine sweetened by honey from the Nile. Even the walls glittered with inlaid gems that caught the torchlight and scattered it like stars. And yet, there was silence, a kind of reverent stillness that filled the room whenever Cleopatra entered. She moved barefoot across onyx floors, her footsteps soundless. Wherever she passed, servants bowed until their foreheads touched the ground. To outsiders, it looked like worship. But to those inside the palace, it was survival. Every morning began with ritual. Cleopatra sat on her alabaster throne as priests anointed her with oils. Behind her stood her watchers, 6 women trained since childhood to observe and report everything they saw. They smiled like friends but acted like spies. Nothing escaped them. Not a conversation, not a glance, not even a breath of doubt. If a guest lingered too long with the wrong smile, the watchers whispered it to the queen. If a servant looked away when she passed, they marked their name for evaluation. By sunset, that person would vanish quietly into the tunnels beneath the palace. It was not paranoia. It was power perfected, Mark Antony once joked. Even the walls have eyes here. Cleopatra smiled and replied, "Not eyes, my love, ears." He laughed, but the truth made him uneasy, because he too was being watched. Every move of his Roman soldiers stationed in Egypt was tracked. Every letter he wrote to Rome was intercepted and copied. Cleopatra read everything before it ever reached him. It wasn't love anymore. It was a chess game, and Antony was the piece she refused to lose. Inside the palace, Cleopatra hosted feasts that dazzled the world. At one banquet, she dissolved a pearl, one of the largest in history, in a goblet of vinegar and drank it before the stunned Roman envoys. It was her way of saying, "I can destroy a fortune in a single sip." At another, she ordered an entire hall flooded ankle-deep with rose petals. The guests waded through fragrance and color, overwhelmed, unable to think of anything but the queen at the center of it all. To Cleopatra, beauty was a form of hypnosis. She ruled through awe, but the true purpose of these displays wasn't pleasure. It was information. Each feast was a trap of silk and music, an invisible interrogation. Cleopatra listened while men boasted. She watched while women whispered. By dawn, she knew their alliances, their weaknesses, their debts. She called it the art of knowing, and she practiced it better than any ruler of her time. In her private chambers, deep beneath the main hall, Cleopatra kept what her priests called the Chamber of Echoes. It wasn't filled with gold or jewels. It was filled with records, scrolls, tablets, coded letters. Every secret she gathered, every confession extracted during her rituals, every whisper carried by her spies, was stored there. Some said she could destroy empires just by reading from those scrolls, and perhaps she did. There was one man, Timon of Cyrene, her royal historian, who dared to ask her once, "Why keep such things, my queen?" Secrets turned to curses in time. Cleopatra smiled faintly and said, "Because one day the gods will stop listening. But men will always fear what I know." That was her true power. Not armies, not gold, but fear, whispered through corridors like incense, invisible but suffocating. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Egypt began to tremble. Taxes rose, crops failed. Soldiers grumbled about Roman command, but Cleopatra kept her focus on her divine empire, a world of gold, mirrors, and shadows, untouched by the suffering of her people. Her court became a sanctuary for the powerful and the corrupt. Roman generals, Greek philosophers, and Egyptian nobles all mingled there, pretending to worship the goddess while secretly plotting for their own gain. Yet none dared defy her, because in Cleopatra's world pleasure was surveillance. The feasts, the rituals, the dances, they were all part of a grand system of control. Desire made men foolish, and foolish men confessed everything. Still, not everyone was blind. Among her inner circle was a young priestess named Asetnefer, one of the watchers. She began to see the cost of this perfection. She saw mothers weeping for sons taken to the underground chambers. She heard the cries beneath the palace, And one night she wrote in her secret journal, "The queen worships beauty, but beauty has become a god that demands blood." That journal, hidden for centuries, would later be found buried under the ruins of Alexandria, its pages charred, but its words hauntingly clear. Cleopatra, though, remained untouched. Every morning she gazed into polished bronze mirrors and whispered, "I am eternal." But her reflection began to flicker. Not from age, she was still radiant, but from exhaustion. The mask of the goddess was heavy, and somewhere deep within her eyes, a shadow had begun to grow. The same eyes that once ruled empires now hid the fear of losing control. Because Cleopatra knew Rome was watching, and Rome was patient. Mark Antony's loyalty was faltering. He missed the order of Rome, the clarity of command. He began to wonder whether love for Cleopatra was love at all, or enchantment. He tried to pull away, but the queen, ever the strategist, tightened her hold with one final promise: "Together we will create a kingdom that even death cannot destroy." But death was already coming, and it was dressed in Roman armor. In the next chapter, we will witness how this empire of gold and desire began to crumble under the weight of Rome's revenge, and how Cleopatra's greatest illusion led her not to immortality, but to her end. The city of Alexandria, once the crown of the ancient world, was changing. Its marble streets, once washed with perfume and laughter, now stank of sweat and ash. The traders whispered. The soldiers drank more than they trained. And in every corner, one name was murmured in fear and awe: Cleopatra. But the tone had changed. It was no longer worship. It was suspicion. Rumors crept through the alleys like smoke. They said the queen no longer left her palace because the sun itself refused to touch her face. They said she slept not with men, but with spirits, calling upon ancient gods in forbidden rites. Others swore they saw her priests carry the bodies of youths into the underground chambers at night, their feet dragging, their eyes still open. Was it true? No one knew. But fear makes truth irrelevant, and Cleopatra's fear had become the pulse of Egypt itself. Inside her palace, the rituals grew darker. Gone were the public festivals of joy and beauty. Now the doors were sealed and the chants turned low, almost mournful. The high priests of Isis told her that Rome's gods were hungry, that only sacrifice, human sacrifice, could keep Egypt from falling. At first, she resisted. She still saw herself as healer, goddess, mother of her people. But fear is a slow poison, and power, once it begins to rot, spreads through every heart it touches. One night, a storm swept across the Nile. The thunder shook the pillars of the palace. Lightning flashed, and in that light, Cleopatra stood alone in her chamber, wearing her golden crown, but trembling beneath its weight. Behind her, the high priest whispered, "You can save Egypt, but the gods demand what you love most." Her eyes filled with tears, for she already knew what he meant. Antony. Far across the sea in Rome, Antony's world was collapsing too. Octavian, the future Augustus, had begun his campaign to destroy Cleopatra's image. He sent letters to the Senate claiming she had bewitched Antony with drugs and demonic spells. He called her the whore of the East, the woman who had stolen Rome's honor. Statues of her were spat upon. Poets mocked her beauty. Priests burned her effigies in public squares, and Antony, torn between two worlds, began to drown in shame. He loved her, but Rome was his blood. Every night he stared into the mirror and whispered, "Who am I now? A general or a ghost?" Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra watched the horizon with dread. The Roman fleets were coming. Each dawn, she climbed the lighthouse tower to see if the sails had appeared. Each dusk, she returned with the same silence in her eyes. Her palace guards grew restless. Her servants fled. Her priests argued in shadows. And through it all, the queen still performed her rituals, alone now, whispering to the statues that had stopped whispering back. One evening, she gathered her watchers, those loyal priestesses who had served her for years. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. Even they had begun to doubt. Cleopatra raised her hand and said softly, "If we must die, we will die as gods, not slaves." She turned to the altar and poured oil into the flames. The scent of myrrh filled the hall, thick and heavy, and as the fire rose, she swore that her name would never fade, even if her body did. Then came the day. The Roman ships arrived, hundreds of them, black sails, iron beaks, the thunder of drums echoing across the bay. Antony rushed to meet them with what little army remained, but it was hopeless. The Battle of Actium ended in disaster. His ships burned, his men scattered, and his heart broke. When news reached Cleopatra, she did not scream. She did not cry. She only whispered, "So the prophecy ends." In a final act of deception, Cleopatra spread the rumor that she was dead, hoping Antony would retreat to her, and they could plan their escape. But when Antony heard the lie, his despair consumed him. He took his sword, pressed it against his chest, and fell upon it. The blade pierced deep, but did not kill him instantly. He was carried bleeding and dying to the palace, and there, in the dim glow of her private chamber, Cleopatra held him one last time. Her tears fell on his face as he gasped, "Do not trust the Romans. They will make you their trophy." Then he was gone. The man who had once been Rome's greatest general died in the arms of Egypt's last queen. After his death, Cleopatra locked herself in her sanctuary. For 3 days no one saw her. Some said she spoke to statues. Some said she saw visions. Others swore they heard her laughter echo through the empty halls, the laughter of a woman who had finally gone mad. When Octavian's soldiers finally broke into the palace, they found her seated on a golden couch, dressed in robes of crimson and white. Her jewels still shone. Her eyes were calm, and beside her, in a basket of woven reeds, coiled the asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra. No one saw her final act, but the marks on her skin told the story. She had chosen her death just as she had chosen her life, in her own way, silent, beautiful, terrifying. When the Romans saw her body, even they hesitated. Octavian, who had dreamed of parading her in chains, looked upon her face and whispered, "She has conquered me even in death." The world mourned and celebrated at once. Some called her a monster, others a martyr, but none could deny her power. The empire she had built with lust, cunning, and brilliance was gone. But her name, Cleopatra, refused to die. Centuries later, historians would try to clean her image. They would call her a scholar, a diplomat, a woman ahead of her time. But deep beneath the layers of myth and marble, another truth remains. A darker truth of control, manipulation, and desire turned into worship. Because Cleopatra was not only the last pharaoh of Egypt, she was the last to truly understand how pleasure could become politics and how belief could be built from fear. But before we close her story, before we leave that palace forever, remember the girl who once stood trembling in oil and gold, believing she had been chosen by the gods. Because the real question now is not about Cleopatra, it's about us. The room is silent again. No music, no chants. Only the whisper of the Nile outside, like the slow exhale of a dying god. The candles tremble. The scent of myrrh clings to the air. The same scent that once filled this room when a young girl no older than 15 stood trembling under golden light. That girl was Cleopatra. And now the goddess is gone. Only the echo of her name remains. We return to that first moment, the beginning of her myth. A naked child in a temple painted with oil and fear. Priests whispering that she was divine, that what would happen to her was sacred, not sin. Tonight, you are Isis. Those words shaped her life. They carved her into something that was no longer human, something larger and lonelier. And for the rest of her days, Cleopatra lived not as a woman, but as an idea, a living statue of beauty, power, and control. But behind the veil, she was always still that trembling child. Trying to believe she was a god, power is a strange poison. It begins as protection, then it becomes hunger, then it becomes the only thing that feels real. Cleopatra's empire was built on that poison. Every ritual, every secret, every kiss and sacrifice, all of it fed a single illusion, that she was chosen by the divine. But when the gods stayed silent, she learned the cruelest truth of all. If you create yourself from myth, you must die as one too. When Octavian's soldiers found her body, her face was calm, almost smiling. Some said she looked relieved, as if death had been the first honest thing to touch her in years. The Romans paraded her image as a warning. But the people, they whispered another story. They said her soul had escaped through the snake's bite, reborn into the stars above the Nile, that she became light, the eternal queen of the heavens. Maybe they believed it because they needed to. Maybe we still believe it for the same reason, because Cleopatra was more than a queen. She was a mirror, showing humanity its hunger for beauty, its worship of power, and its addiction to control. Every lover who adored her wanted to own her. Every enemy who feared her wanted to destroy her, and in the end, both got what they wanted. Her story forces us to ask, who are the real monsters? The queen who used seduction to survive? Or the world that gave her no other weapon? The people of Egypt paid the price for her divinity. Their taxes built her temples. Their sons filled her chambers. Their daughters were trained as her handmaidens, their bodies painted, perfumed, and prepared for service to the goddess, all in the name of faith, all in the name of beauty, all in the name of something higher that never existed. History repeats this pattern again and again. A few at the top decide what is holy, and the rest must bleed to keep the illusion alive. Think of it. Cleopatra's story is more than 2,000 years old, and yet the pattern hasn't changed. Today, our gods wear different faces: fame, money, control. Our temples are made of glass and steel, and still, young souls stand trembling before the same false altars, told that what will happen next is not sin, but sacred. The world has just changed its costumes. The rituals remain, so when you remember Cleopatra, don't just see the queen in gold, see the girl beneath the crown. The one who never asked to be worshipped, but learned that power was the only protection left to her. Imagine her last breath. The silence, the slow curl of the snake's body around her arm, her eyes closing, and not in fear but in release, as if whispering, "At last, I am human again." And yet, even now, her name refuses to die, because every time someone uses beauty to control, or faith to deceive, or love to dominate, Cleopatra's shadow flickers back into existence. She is every lie we tell to survive, every mask we wear to hide our fear, every dream we chase until it destroys us. She is the reflection of our corruption, polished in gold, wrapped in silk, and worshipped until it burns. So, what was Cleopatra? A victim? A genius? A monster? Maybe all three. Maybe that's what makes her immortal. But one thing is certain. The system that made her, that same machine of belief, beauty, and fear, still exists. It just wears a different crown now. And as the screen fades to black and the echo of the Nile grows faint, remember this. History isn't written by heroes or villains. It's written by those who understood how to make others believe. Cleopatra mastered belief, and belief in the end is stronger than truth. So, tonight, when you close your eyes, picture her one last time. The chamber glows with oil lamps. The serpent's hiss fades into silence. And the queen, the girl who became a goddess, takes her final breath beneath the weight of eternity. Remember Cleopatra. Remember the victims who stood before her altar. Remember how power always disguises itself as holiness, because this is not just her story, it's ours. Comment below. Do you think Cleopatra was a victim of her time, or the architect of her own destruction? Subscribe now, because in the next episode, we expose the truth behind Rome's secret cult of Venus and the hidden rituals that shaped the empire's fall. Share this story. Keep questioning. And never forget, beauty, power, and faith have always shared the same bed.